Good afternoon, Dr. Yates. Thank you so much.
Hi. Not very long a doctor, so it still feels good to hear that.
It always does. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak to our students at the ANU today. This week in our course, we're exploring the question of policy capacity or the capabilities of governments, specifically those of public managers. I was wondering if I could start by asking you about the role and importance of political skills.
Yep, sure. Well, thank you for inviting me to be a part of POGO 8062, which is a delightful name for a class. The importance of political skills. Actually, there are two things that we write about. I should acknowledge this is based on work with my colleagues, Jean Hartley, Owen Hughes, and John Alford. So we write about political astuteness, which we define as deploying political skills in situations involving diverse and competing interests in order to achieve outcomes. And so as for what those political skills are, you've probably set a reading. Did you set our reading? Yeah.
Yes.
So your students would know what our 5-part framework is, so I won't go into that in detail. And as for why political astuteness is important, my colleagues and I argue that managers in all sectors increasingly need political astuteness in order to do their jobs effectively because of our increasingly complex modern operating environment. But we think this is especially so for public managers because they work in a political environment, even if they're not supposed to be big P political operators. So public managers need to understand the formal political environment in order to be effective servants of the government of the day. But it's not just about formal politics. The formal politics stuff has always been there for managers, but we think there are three main factors that are boosting the need for political astuteness in public managers today. And the first one is the rise of network governance, which makes non-government actors more prominent in policy making and service delivery. So managers need to interact with them as stakeholders and partners, and they often need to influence them without any concrete formal authority to do that. And then relatedly, there's the rise of wicked problems that can't be addressed by everyone just working within their own department or policy area. So public managers have to be more attuned than ever to the shifting politics of alliances between government, the NGO sector, and the private sector. And then there's the public-facing, the media angle, 24-hour news cycle, hyperconnectivity, which demand very fast responses by government and mean that public managers need to really anticipate the media implications of policy issues. So that's why we think that public managers can't afford not to be politically astute. But there's also a public value argument. So we think that actually political astuteness is very important for creating public value because your student would be familiar with the framework.
Yep, we've done Moore's framework on public value and
yeah. So we think that you can actually look at it from all 3 points of the triangle about why political astuteness is important. It helps managers make sense of the various voices coming from inside and outside the organization about what's valuable and what's feasible. One of our interviewees talked about it as the ability to synthesize all of this noise that politicians in particular are always hearing. And it helps managers align their complex authorizing environment to get decisions made. And it helps with organizational capacity, that implementation stage that so often gets overlooked, getting ducks in line to actually get policies and programs implemented once the decisions have been made. So if you're not politically astute, you might be very technically skilled in understanding the issues, you might be good at eliciting stakeholder opinions, you might be great at managing the budget bottom line, but you can't bring those things together to help your political masters create valuable outcomes. That's why we think, that's the outline of why these things are so important.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I was wondering if I could ask you a little bit about how do public managers rate their own political skills or the political astuteness of their colleagues?
So we asked about both of those things, and it was actually kind of funny. We had a sample of just over 1,000 managers, and we asked them how they rated their own political astuteness and that of their colleagues. I won't go into exactly the details of the rating scale, but it was on a scale of 1 to 6. And overall managers rated themselves at just over 4, so kind of average. and their colleagues at just under 4.
Okay.
And we looked at the 5 different dimensions of political astuteness, and that was pretty consistent across the 5. With the biggest difference being personal skills like being proactive and being self-aware. People rated themselves at about 4.2 and their colleagues at around 3.6. So it's kind of like how everyone is an above average driver when you ask them. All public managers are just slightly more politically astute than their colleagues.
Yeah.
And we also compared 3 countries, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. And we noticed that Kiwi respondents rated themselves significantly higher than the other 2 countries. I mean, not a huge difference, but it was noticeable. And we did have a smaller sample for New Zealand, so we can't be too sure about what's going on there. But we did enjoy speculating wildly about maybe it's because their departments are smaller over there, but they have quite a few politicians still. So you're just more likely to get personal interaction with politicians in the New Zealand department, especially if you work in Wellington. So it's possible everything's just a lot more intensified and you need higher skills over there. That's just a little snapshot.
All right, thank you. Could I ask you to reflect a bit on what options or strategies are available for public managers to increase these political skills? Or can they be increased, or are they something that are inherent?
Yes, actually. Yeah, we have material on just that. And there were really 2 things we're talking about here. One is what options are available for developing political astuteness currently, and the other is what options could there be.
Yeah.
I'm working on a paper with Jean Hartley right now about these things, so I'll give you a bit of a preview about what we've been thinking about. The
Sure.
first thing to say is to respond to you, and we do actually believe that these skills develop over time. It seems kind of obvious in some ways, but there is a bit of a folk tendency to say, well, some people have political nous and some don't. Well, we don't think that's true. It may be that some people are predisposed to being naturally a little better about the political aspects of their jobs. We're not arguing about that. But all it took was asking our interview participants about how they developed over time. And they were pretty clear that there'd been a learning curve. And we also had some survey data looking at this. We compared the self-ratings of middle, senior, and very senior managers. Very senior had the highest and middle the lowest, and that was statistically significant. So yes, it can be developed. As for how, we gave our survey participants a bunch of potential influences, and we asked how useful has each of these things been in developing your political astuteness, specifically your political astuteness. And there are a list of 24. And the 5 influences that rated the highest were all experience-based or observation-based methods. Things like gaining experience on the job, learning from mistakes, handling crises, a good example of a senior manager, and observing role models. And then just to take the top and the bottom, the 5 at the bottom were more structured and formal, like attending a learning set, having formal mentoring, having professional coaching, reading leadership books. Overall, with the list of 24, we did find experiential methods generally higher and formal or structured methods generally lower. But we think that's how things are right now. It's not an ought. So the public sector is still not great at acknowledging the political dimensions of public managers' jobs, as you probably know. And if you don't acknowledge that these skills are necessary, it's hard to develop them in any coherent way. So it might just be that these formal interventions aren't being experienced as useful for developing political skills because they're not currently designed that way.
Right.
So that was survey data. With interviews, the most common things that people mentioned were observations of other managers and politicians, not only about what to do, but also quite a lot about what not to do. And a lot of people mentioned gaining experience in the job, like being placed in roles where you have no formal authority, but you're required to influence people, or being in a fast-paced political environment like the Premier's department or another central agency. And quite a few people mentioned these kind of critical incidents or light bulb moments where they realized a crucial thing or they figured out they still had a lot to learn. I could tell you a couple of those anecdotes if that would be interesting.
Sure.
My favorite one is probably this manager early in their career said that they were observing a party meeting, like a political party meeting.
Okay.
And suddenly the Prime Minister walked into this meeting unexpectedly. And the politician who'd been speaking at the time abandoned their speaking notes. And the quote was, started turning intellectual somersaults around some very unpromising material. And this was this manager's first kind of vivid introduction to the idea that politicians also have internal party audiences as well as external audiences, and you have to be aware of those and how things will be received internally and externally.
Yeah, true. Wow.
So that was pretty funny. And then there was one guy who was trying to implement something as a public manager that had been decided on in cabinet a while ago, like in a previous administration, and walked into a room with some senior officials from one of the largest departments in that jurisdiction and realized that those people weren't on board with this political decision that had been made. And they knew their power and they were going to obstruct the implementation of this decision. And this guy realized, oh, well, actually, my formal cabinet decision doesn't necessarily mean much if I haven't done the work of aligning the rest of the authorizing environment. And the training that was seen as useful tended to be about, well, studying politics at university is obviously a big one, but things that broaden people's experience and worldview. Negotiation training was often seen as important in developing political astuteness, and other things that broaden people's horizons, like moving departments, going on secondment, working overseas, cross-boundary working, and senior executive courses like some training organizations run. They aren't specifically focused on political astuteness, but things like the Australian-New Zealand School of Government Executive Fellows Program and the Harvard Kennedy School runs a similar program where they bring senior executives from a lot of different jurisdictions together, kind of like, you know, what you're doing right now in your school. And when people see how things are done elsewhere, that's actually a really good precursor to developing political astuteness. So we talked to one person who did the ANSEL course, and she said that although she knew she'd become very good at unpeeling the various layers of the onion, going on this course made her realize that there were bigger vegetables out there. So that was kind of a cute way of encapsulating that.
Yeah.
And there was one other thing I thought about saying when we asked people about how they develop political astuteness in their own staff. So that can be pretty telling. And one interesting idea that came out of that was storytelling. So a couple of people talked about having regular informal meetings where they had a cup of tea and talked about things they'd been trying, what had worked, what hadn't, and why. And so that can be a way of having those critical incidents, I guess, told to you rather than experiencing them yourself. And therefore they can be instructive, but slightly less painful because you don't have to go through that mistake yourself necessarily. And someone said they tried to bring in politicians or ex-politicians to tell war stories to staff. So even if your department doesn't give you any formal opportunities to develop, there are other things that you can do.
All right. Terrific. Thank you so much for all of this. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Yates. Really appreciate this.
No problem.
Thank you. Okay.